Okay, we're going live on YouTube.
Okay.
Okay, I'm recording too now.
Oh, Michael Roberts is here. That's great. And who else are we waiting for, Jenny? Apart from Michael?
Is it Peng?
Peng, yes. Zhao Chang Peng.
And just to let you know, we're live on YouTube.
Yes. Paul, could you also keep an eye on the participants and let Jenny and me know, or Jenny know as soon as Pang gets here? His name is Zhao Chang Pang. You can see him in the participants list.
I'll let him in when he arrives.
That's good.
Bob McKee is between us now.
Sorry?
Bob McKee is between
Yes.
us.
Bob,
Okay.
yeah, he is here. Michael is here. That's it.
Yes, get the name right, Elias.
Oh, great, man. I think I found a lot of agreement now.
Yeah, Radhika, it's important to use the correct name.
I'm thinking of changing it for a third name just to confuse you soon.
Yeah, that'll help. That'll help.
Okay, so it's 1 past. So Jenny, it's up to you. You can start whenever you like.
Right, well, I'll start now. And welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining this event, which is to mark the publication of the English version of Socialist Economic Development in the 21st Century by Elias, Jabor and Alberto, Gabriele. The event is being jointly put on by the International Marxist Group and Friends of Socialist China. And let me, first of all, on behalf of both groups, extend congratulations to Elias and Alberto for this book, for us. You know, it's a very important book, coming as it does from the perspective that we all share, namely that a century since the first socialist revolution broke the global monopoly of capitalism, socialist economic construction continues to offer the most viable alternative to the globalized capitalist crisis. And of course, before our eyes, the multiple crises facing the world are deepening. The system of moribund capitalism, riven by contradictions, is listing ever further into the doldrums. Yet precisely when they are so needed, the progressive forces in the world remain fragmented and confused about what a socialist alternative might be. Even where leftist forces have come together, in Chile, for example, and hopefully France, their basis of unity needs to be consolidated on socialist ground. Now, in my view, confusion over socialism is very much to do with the carryover of debates from the 20th century. Well-worn ground over state and class, plan versus market, divorced from the lived experience of socialism, have become ossified. And none more so than in the case of debates about whether or not China is capitalist or socialist. Yet, understanding the nature of China's social system could not now be more important as the Western warlords launch their moral crusade to divide the world between so-called democracies and so-called autocracies, so as to isolate China along with Russia, bringing us to the point of most extreme danger, the threat of nuclear war. China, which sees itself as the primary stage of socialism, presents us, of course, with a contradictory picture. The continuing expansion of markets, extensive privatization, the growth of the private sector, and the emergence of some giant corporations, opening to foreign investment, stock markets, corruption, environmental damage, poor working conditions, increasing inequality. But at the same time, absolute poverty has been eradicated, the welfare of the people has improved, the working class has grown exponentially, and the amount and quality of assets in state hands has grown hugely, with the state becoming a vastly more effective operator. So these contradictions really challenge our understanding of socialism. A mechanistic plan versus market approach, in fact, fails to grasp the dialectics between plan and state, as demonstrated in Chinese experience, where the market enhances the state and the state guides and shapes the market. It is not that the state simply sits atop a system of public ownership, gripping hold of the means of production. It is, in fact, a dynamic actor balancing multiple policy levers, now creating disruption to push forward development, now seeking to restore stability. The dynamic approach of Chinese socialism is rooted in Mao's 1956 work on the 10 major relationships: agriculture and industry, light and heavy industry, the state and producers, China and the external world, and so on. These are envisaged as contradictions constantly shifting between balance and imbalance, proportion and disproportion. And it is through this dialectical and materialist approach that the CPC is able to take a long-term view, planning ahead for 2025, 2030, 2049, identifying stages, setting priorities, sequencing, all whilst retaining flexibility to grasp opportunities and meet challenges. To turn to Jabor and Gabriele's book, it's divided into two parts. One considering essential concepts from Marxism, such as mode of production, law of value, productive and unproductive labor. And from this generates a series of laws of social development. And the second part, drawing on these concepts and laws, and with reference also to development literature, it looks at the cases of China, Vietnam, and Laos, all following a path of market reform from a similar base of Soviet centralized planning, though under different national conditions. In what ways then do Jabor and Gabriele open up new approaches to the key questions and debates before us? How to think about socialism in the 21st century, how to consider the legacy of the Soviet experience, how to characterize Chinese socialism and its direction, and how is it possible for socialism to advance under the constraints of world capitalism? How come China has managed to limit dependency on internal finance? And how is it possible, after all, for socialism and capitalism to coexist within a nation and indeed the world? And what difference can and is a socialist China with its growing world influence making for those around the world pursuing a socialist orientation? So to discuss this book and to no doubt raise their own perspectives, we have a distinguished panel of Marxist political economists, and I look forward to a stimulating debate. Before I hand over to Elias and Alberto, I'll just explain the outline for this afternoon, which is for the authors to present their key ideas in about 15 minutes. Then we'll have 8 minutes each for the 6 panelists. We'll follow this with a Q&A session for the panel, and then the authors finally bringing up the end, replying to the contributions and questions at the last moment. And if you're going to be using the chat and putting questions in the chat, I will in fact ask for people who have questions to use the raised hand function, and hopefully I'll be able to spot you from that. So the last thing for me to do now is to introduce Elias. Elias Jabbour is adjunct professor at the Faculty of Economic Sciences, postgraduate programs in economic sciences and international relations at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. And Alberto Gabriele is a senior researcher at, and this is going to defeat me, I'm afraid, Spillanzia Mochi in Rome, Italy. So over to you, Elias and Alberto.
Okay, Thank you, Jenny. Thank you all. First of all, I would like to thank you all for being here at this event of immense significance for me. To tell the truth, I never imagined launch a book between some of the most prestigious non-Western Marxist thinkers. Direct from Brazil, I send a hug to Professor Rodrigo Desai, my great friends John Ross and Michael Roberts, to Professor Mick Dunford, and I convey my immense satisfaction to count on the presence of our master Cheng and Fu and Professor Peng from China. A warm hug to my study research and book companion Alberto Gabriele. The history of this book is something interesting. I remember very well that in my scientific initiation research 25 years ago, I had in line with my research group's contact with the concept of socioeconomic formation. My Marxist background is strongly influenced by authors who work on the use this concept, the concept of socioeconomic formation, like Lenin, Mao Zedong, Amilcar Cabral, Mariátegui, and Inácio Rangel. This concept that emerged with great force in Lenin was always present in my intellectual trajectory. Consequently, my distance from Western Marxism occurred since my first year's university. The name of my first study group university was Study Group of Marxian Concept of Socioeconomic Formation, and since my first year of university, this concept is present in my life. My distance of Western Marxism is because one of the characteristics of Western Marxism is the lack of a vision of historical process, totality, and multiple determinations of concrete. It's a Marxism that rejects Hegel. In my point of view, Hegel is an author that was expelled from Western. I don't know why. And absorbs many of the positivist and Kantian assumptions. Hence, the strength in the West to observe socialism as an expression of a checklist to be completed. On the contrary, in this book, you access a vision on socialism based on the Hegelian point. The concepts manifests itself in the real movement. I've discussed it a few times with my friend, Michael Roberts here, about that. In other words, if there is no checklist for socialism and the concept manifests itself in the real movement, the great question that this book seeks to answer is 2 points. What's the historical form that socialism takes today? With a view of historical and geopolitical constraints. This point's condition is existent since the first experience in the last century and the great experience of our time in China. It's for this answer that the concept of socioeconomic formation presents itself to me particularly as the concept of the frontier of the human and social science. If socialism with Chinese characteristics is a formation, then it's something in motion. The question, what's the essence of this movement? My meeting with Alberto Gabriele is an interest case because about 10 years ago, I realized that I'm in Brazil and he in Italy. We're looking for the same answers and the starting point from a common point, the famous concept of socioeconomic formation, and the perception that in China, a new socioeconomic formation was emerging. An overview of our publications since the second half of the last decade is proof that we were observing the same movement with the same look, with the same perception, and most importantly, using in different ways the concept of socioeconomic formation as a basis for our analysis. Not surprisingly, we both worked on the hypothesis that China and its market socialism should be treated as a socialist experience, but of another type. Our meeting was a great gift that life gave me. I confess here, Alberto Gabriele is my best friend and best companion to research and other things. To deliver a new and disruptive contribution on Chinese dynamics and the true face of socialism in our time, free of dogmatisms and checklists. We were clear that we were breaking with a way of thinking rooted not only in 2 or 3 generations of Western communist intellectuals. We were breaking away from a powerful, almost mythical vision of Marxism and socialism. China and market socialism should be treated as a new, distinct socioeconomic formation. This observation can be considered as the first and most difficult part of the history. Once we are convinced of this, as our particular paths bear witness, observing and classifying the operating logics of this new socioeconomic formation has become our common search. We demonstrate that China is the first experience of the new class of socioeconomic formation that emerged with the economic reform in the 1970s. Historicizing and broad vision led us to verify that this class of socioeconomic formation is, in principle, the product of a reinvention of Chinese socialism through market institutions, making the object of analysis reconnect with this new socioeconomic formation generates reconnect with its millenary mercantile roots, generate virtuous mercantile growth. The dynamics of this new socioeconomic formation generates new internal modes of production, which in turn generate new combinations whose regularities can be apprehended starting from the observation both of a wave of institutional innovations launched by Chinese states since then, and the historical forms that the economic planning take place in the country. If getting out of so-called conceptual and dogmatic comfort zone is not possible, it's not possible to break with the model and quasi-mystical notions that socialism have been entrenched since the mid-19th century, and after the split of Marxism between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism. We are aware of the clashes and controversies that this book will generate. Differently, the Soviet Union, this new socioeconomic formation, develops as part of the capitalist world. This perception is fundamental to understand the limits imposed by capitalism on the development of non-capitalist socioeconomic formation. We cannot choose the circumstance to make history. This is an important point. A large part of the misconceptions about the nature of Chinese system is the failure to realize that China, Vietnam, and Laos don't develop under external circumstances created by a socialist order. Instead, therefore, this book is the history not only of how the Chinese material base and the new historical forms of planning that have emerged in China since 1978 seek to adapt China to hostile international political and economic order. We try to get further. If concepts are historical construction, we must make an effort to resignificate Marxism in the light of the development of capitalism and socialism in the last century and nowadays. This is not revisionism, but an imperative of science, first of all. We start this book destructing the new classical notion of home economics to demonstrate that socialism is a scientifically possible society, not a utopia, and we ended up describing that we call the new projected economy. This name is a tribute to Brazilian economist Inácio Rangel, who, In 559, in the book Elements of Project-Based Economy, identify a series of particularities in the Soviet economy that our view returned with a new form and strained in China today, even conforming to a historical form where socialism, by being able to project, coordinate, and execute thousands of projects simultaneously has as its main historical form, in my point of view, in our point of view, the transformation of a reason into an instrument of a government. The historical form of socialism now, in our point of view, is the transformation of a reason into an instrument of government. We arrived at the concept of the new project economy seeking answers to the growing capacity to Chinese government to intervene in its territory very quickly. The response to 2008 crisis, when we observed thousands of projects being executed simultaneously by 96 great state-owned conglomerates, with the support of immense financial engineering, led us to think that in China, new and higher forms of economic planning were emerging. We also discovered that this new and higher forms of economic planning were the result of proactive industrial policies launched in the 11th five-year plan, and that led to emergence within the scope of the state-owned company of a disruptive technological innovations, such as 5G, artificial intelligence, the big data, and more recently, the computer. The possibility of elevating the human dominion of the nature was open, and consequently, new economic irregularities emerged and demand discovery. The new project-based economy is the current historical form of socialism, and observing the China's success in the fight against the pandemic and poverty is the realization of what Karl Marx called the grandeur, objectified or scientific capability. I close this initial presentation stating our spirit of satisfaction with a well-done work. It may sound cliche, but in times of darkness and the resurgence of fascism in a global scale, is interesting to observe China and all the institutional and economic instruments used in this broad victory against the pandemic, with two conclusions. The hypothesis launched in this book have been confirmed, and the history is not over. Anyway, this book raises many debates and discussions. I think it's best to end here my emotional statement, dedicate this moment to my family, my wife, Michelle, my stepdaughter, Lara, and my 2.5-year-old son, Khalil. Without their strength, I would not have made it this far. Thank you too much for all.
Thank you so much, Elias. I'm just wondering, is Alberto going to say a few words, or is he going to speak at the end?
Alberto?
He is muted. Alberto, you are muted. We cannot hear you. Non possiamo ascoltare. Alberto, you are muted. We cannot hear you.
Is it okay?
Now it's okay.
Okay. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll show you some basic elements of our book and with a few slides. And then if there is time, we'll talk about them, about the whole thing more thoroughly later on. So this is the book. doesn't go down. Do you see the slide?
Yes, we see the slide. Yeah, that's
okay.
That's good.
So we tried to provide a novel, what we call a novel, some way heterodox view of the global evolution of capitalism and socialism. So extending the basic framework of interpretation of what is called the modern classical economic theory, that is largely shared by most modern Marxists. And we propose a partial interpretation of various Marxian categories. Of course, the most important one is the mode of production, on the basis of the lessons of history, of course. Do you see it? Yes. Can you see the slide?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So in our view, the mode of production has to be seen as an abstract system. And we try to apply this category at a very high level of abstraction. So in our way, a mode of production has to be seen as a set of internally consistent rules and laws of self-preservation and movement of an economic system. On the other hand, socioeconomic formations are concrete, historically existing objects, and they are essentially a specific complex of social relations of production and exchange that obtain in a certain country or group of countries over a long period of time. And on a global scale, the dominant social relations of production and exchange are decisively, but not exclusively, influenced by the power of the strongest and most advanced countries that in turn are essentially run by the interests of their ruling classes or powerful social groups. So we also utilize slightly different concepts such as primacy, dominance, and prevalence to try to describe the coexistence of different MPs. So essentially, in our view, one mode of production has primacy in a certain socioeconomic formation if it is the most important and relevant. For instance, in the USA, we can say that almost 100% the country is obviously capitalist. But in most other cases, especially in the global south, the primacy of one mode of production over the other is a relative one, because several different modes of production coexist in a flux and in a dialectic relationship among themselves. So in our way, in our view also, we have to distinguish between dominance and prevalence. The dominance of a given mode of production manifests itself in a hierarchical vertical fashion. So, for instance, in a place like India, it's clear that the dominant mode of production is capitalism. On the other hand, prevalence refers to the social solution of production that provide the livelihood of the majority. So again in India, but in most parts of the global south, there are a lot of subsistence peasants, informal workers, etc. Essentially, if you look at them at the microeconomic levels, they do not essentially live and reproduce themselves inside really capitalist social relations of production. But nevertheless, they submitted to the dominance of capitalism. Okay, so the world is a complicated matter, and not all social economic formations are the same. In particular, there is a small class of socialist-oriented socioeconomic formations, and which are countries that are not dominated by an exploitative ruling class. On the other hand, they do not fully embody pure socialist principles either. So elements of socialism are present in these countries, in these sociological formations, and they're hegemonic, but they're not. But they do not dominate the whole country. So there is also in all these countries a non-hegemonic capitalist class still exists, and the crucial issue is to see the relationship between the socialist-oriented forces that retain the political power and the presence and the activities of this capitalist class. As far as it is not hegemonic, it's legitimate to talk tentatively about socialism. Of course, it's not a perfect form of socialism. And what are now socialist-oriented socioeconomic formations might or not evolve in the future towards more advanced forms of market socialism. Okay, so the key argument of our book is that the end of the first socialist experiences in Europe and Central Asia was not the end of history. More advanced processes of socialist-oriented development are presently unfolding in various countries, and they constitute a promising example and the reason of hope for socialists and progressives all over the world. We also have three major propositions that we try to put forward in our book. The first is, during most epochs, one mode of production tends to be globally dominant, but there are also historical periods where a transition occurs from one another to another dominant mode of production. This happens at global level and also happens at national level. So, as a general rule, two or more modes of production coexist in all countries, and their interrelationship evolves in a state of perennial flux. And our third proposition is that this does not mean that we can have any kind of configurations of different modes of production. Only some configurations of modes of production can historically occur both at the national and international level, because there is a set of immanent and universal structural restrictions that we call meta mode of productions. And these restrictions constrain, in practical terms, the degrees of freedom of all national attempts to proceed towards socialism, overcoming capitalism. So, socialist-oriented developmental states, because all these states are also developmental states, must promote GDP growth and technical progress, of course, but they must also promote the expansion of the welfare state, so basic services, safety nets, etc. Finally, a proper harmonic equilibrium between these two different goals. And they must do such a thing without excessively challenging the low barrier. In particular, in our view, the state can and should hold on publicly owned capital and try to ever increase the value of this capital. So there is the phenomenon of capital valorization is not unique to capitalism, but it also applies to socialism. And they also must try, as they're doing, try to transform core industrial enterprises into international competitive national champions in order to have sectoral leaders as harbingers and facilitators of the march of the entire domestic economy towards the global technology frontier and hopefully beyond. At present, almost all socialist-oriented socioeconomic formations, among all the People's Republic of China is the only one that is the one that has advanced most, but it's not the only one that is existing. So we also introduced the concept of new projectment economy. So while the other propositions, about the other proposition, we are reasonably certain of being able to demonstrate their correctness. With respect to this last but not least important concept and category, we consider it at a lower level of seriousness, and we consider that now essentially that present-day China is possibly tentatively entered a new stage, and we call this new stage of development of China new projectment economy. Anyway, this development is a very recent one that cannot be firmly identified yet. So what's projectment? The projector is the ability on the part of a state to engineer quality leaps by means of ad hoc, focused and coordinated initiatives that are able to channel enormous resources towards specific paramount goals, some of which are related to the development of productive forces, while other ones are essentially aimed at the direct solution of major social and environmental problems. These kind of major actions that are necessary for the development of socialist countries and ultimately for the survival of the whole humanity are not, by their own nature, are not amenable to be taken via market mechanisms. So the only way is to utilize large sums of capital mediated by state-owned banks in order to earmark them towards a vast array of policy tools that are aimed at these goals. And these policy tools are plans, projects, industrial policies, regulation, institutional changes, and the like. So major examples of the quality leaps I was talking about are the BRI, the Made in China 2025, and the recently concluded anti-poverty plan. For instance, and there is an evolution also of qualitative nature. For instance, in the 14th five-year plan of China, we see that there is not a specific GDP growth target, but there are identified specific goals also in other indicators, including unemployment, energy consumption, and so on, in order to improve people's livelihood and quality of development and not being obsessed exclusively attached to the very limited concept of GDP. So, from a theoretical point of view, after all, there is nothing in the new projectment economy that is completely new as such, if you take it alone. What's new is the combination of an unprecedented scale of pre-existing elements. So we can tentatively consider this new projectment economy as a sub-period belonging to the second long-term development period of China as a Marxist socialist socioeconomic formation. As we know, this second period initiated basically in 1978 and has brought China to become a powerful market socialist economy. I conclude mentioning Vietnam. There is a whole part of the book dedicated to Vietnam, and we try to show that Vietnam, in a completely independent way, is broadly advancing on a similar trajectory with respect to China. But as it is less advanced, we don't see elements of such a quality leap in Vietnam yet, in spite of the fact that Vietnam's economy is basically doing pretty well. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and for those very helpful slides. I think that there was a request in the chat to share those slides, so I hope that can be arranged. I think that from Elias and Alberto, from the presentations, we can see how fruitful and productive their methodological approach has been, going back to the basic concepts of Marxism and talking about modes of production and the interaction of modes of production. Of course, there are all sorts of questions about how modes of production articulate together and influence accumulation and the appropriation, different ways of appropriating the surplus. So, as I said, I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion now of these key ideas. And I think that the first contributor will be Professor Cheng Fu, who's going to be speaking to us through a video recording with the assistance of a translator. Cheng Fu, of course, is a very well-known Marxist scholar, known around the world. He's an academician at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He's a director of the Research Center for Economic and Social Development, principal professor at the University of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and familiar to many of us as president of the World Association of Political Economy, which brings together Marxist scholars from around the world in fascinating conferences, which I'd certainly recommend. He's also president of the Chinese Society of Foreign Economic Theories and a member of the People's Congress of China. He's going to be speaking to us through his translator, Liu Zizhu, and I hope that Liu, is everything ready? Is everything ready to show?
Yes. Yeah. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I will. My name is Liu Zizhu, and I work in the Academy of Marxism, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I will be presenting on behalf of Professor Cheng Fu, and I will share with you his video. I hope it works well now. Okay. So, good evening from Beijing. Alberto, Gabriele, and Elias Jabbour's monograph on the economic development of several socialist countries in the 21st century deserves careful reading and great attention. In the following, I will address a few potentially controversial points on the subject of economic development in China and the Soviet Union as two examples of socialist countries in response to the misconceptions that have been prevailing in the world today. The first point I want to make here is that the Soviet Union has made great achievements in economic and social development. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Soviet Union, which is worth commemorating. However, because of the Gorbachev and Yeltsin leadership group's betrayal and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Western world generally denies the achievements in economic and social development of the Soviet Union. In my opinion, after the October Revolution, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Lenin, established the dictatorship of the proletariat and the centralized democratic system, carried out large-scale economic, social, educational, and cultural construction, repelled the armed aggression of 14 capitalist countries, and developed a number of theories and successful practices for building socialism in one country under the siege of capitalist countries. Guided by Lenin's idea, the Soviet Union saw great achievements in economy, politics, education, science and technology, culture, health, people's livelihood, society, ecology, and national defense. Without the invasion and near destruction of the Soviet Union by fascist Germany with its monopolistic bourgeois totalitarian politics, or if the Socialist Soviet Union had not been dismantled by a coup d'etat, the economic strength and comprehensive national power of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 21st century would have caught up with and surpassed that of the United States, which relied on internal exploitation and external plunder. The second point I want to make here is that China's economic and social development before the reform and opening up created what is called the first miracle. After comparing and analyzing a large number of domestic and foreign statistics, we can make this objective judgment that during the 100 years since the First Opium War, the economic and social development of the old China was extremely slow. And in general, it showed a backward, defeated, and poor state with decaying society. And the gap between its economic and social development and that of the major countries in the world had been widening. In the first 30 years of the new China, despite the unfavorable conditions, such as lack of experience in socialist construction, economic blockade by capitalist countries, rapid population growth, and aids to other countries, the pace of economic and social development in China was greatly accelerated, accompanied by a qualitative leap in the quality and structural layout of development, fundamentally reversing the trend of China's marginalization in the world system, and narrowing the economic gap with major countries in the world. And it has to be noted that China's choice of market economy was not based on any previous failure. It is more precise, it is more exact. The more precise evaluation should be that it happened when planned economy has fulfilled its tasks, and a different approach is needed in order to, for the next stage, in order to achieve better and faster development. As Yale professor Morris Meissner points out, in the post-Mao era, it has become fashionable to blow up and talk negatively about the blemishes of the historical record of the Mao era, and to keep quiet about the achievements of his time. In fact, far from being the era of economic stagnation that is now commonly perceived, Mao's era saw one of the greatest modernization in world history, comparable with the most intense industrialization in several major latecomers in modern times, such as Germany, Japan, and Russia. The continuity and the two miracles in the 70 years of the People's Republic of China has been officially recognized in China by the Communist Party of China and by the mass of Chinese people. The third point here I want to make is that China's economic and social development after the reform and opening up has created its second miracle, and China has entered the rank of sub-middle rich and powerful countries in the world. As of 2012, China's industrial output and foreign exchange reserves have leaped to the first place in the world. Total economic volume has steadily ranked second in the world. Its education, science, technology, and healthcare have developed significantly. People's livelihood has been tremendously improved from subsistence to moderately well off. Hong Kong and Macau have successfully returned to China, and its international status has been raised. The fourth point I want to make today is that the construction of socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era since 2013 is creating the third economic miracle. China has entered the stage of moderately rich and strong country as a quasi-center in the world economic system. Its scientific, technological, economic, and ecological construction has jumped to a new level. Moreover, through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Asian Development Bank, and other international cooperation, it has contributed Chinese wisdom and provided Chinese solutions for human development, promoted the construction of a community of shared future for humanity with increased international appeal and influence. I confidently predict that if China basically achieves modernization in 2035, it will become one of the countries of sub-high wealth and wealthy and powerful in the center of the world economic system. If it achieves full modernization in 2050, it will be one of the top countries in the world economic system, which will break the monopoly of the world economic system by the old and the new imperialist and developed capitalist countries. The last point here I want to make is that the future socialist economy will develop better in the process of countering Western hegemony. Lenin's conclusion that imperialism is war is not outdated. Global and regional hegemonism easily leads to war. The Russian-Ukraine war that is happening today is a conflict triggered by the 5 illegal expansions eastward of NATO as an aggressive military group headed by the United States. And it is the result of Russia's being forced to counter the US Western hegemony, which will negatively affect the entire world economy and people's livelihood, except for the US military-industrial complex, which has greatly profited in this war. Since the US and the Western monopoly capitalist cannot be in China's socialist economy, in recent years, the US and the West have intensified their ganging up around China, cobbled together the Indo-Pacific version of NATO, established the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Organization against China, and tried to provoke China's civil war for the unification of Taiwan through political and military provocations in order to impose comprehensive sanctions against China and hinder China's socialist modernization. However, that things contains opportunities towards a better situation. China has implemented a new development pattern based on domestic circulation and dual circulation, enhancing the degree of self-reliance, autonomy, self-sufficiency, and self-improvement of the national economy, and continuously establishing and improving new scientific and technological chains, industrial chains, supply chains, and economic and trade chains, which leads to better development of China's socialist national economy and people's livelihood. To conclude, I believe that the socialist market economies of Vietnam and Laos and the socialist planned economies of Cuba and North Korea, which are illegally blockaded by the US and the West, will all achieve greater economic and social development in the 21st century. And that's all of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liu, for your translation there. And I think from Cheng and Fu's discussion there, we can see, the point that socialism isn't a thing. It's something that is in process of change. And indeed, we need to pay close attention to how China is responding in order to pursue its targets and goals for the future in relation to the pressures from US and Western hegemonism. So I think we shall move on now to Mick. Mick Dunford is next. He's an emeritus professor from University of Sussex in England, visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and he's also managing editor of the journal Area Development and Policy. Mick is based in China and keeps a close eye on the developments there, continues to study particularly urban China, and he always has useful and insightful comments to make. So over to you there, Mick.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to comment on Elias and Alberto's new and impressive study. Elias and Alberto have written a significant and important book. First, in its concern with China, Vietnam, and Laos, and especially in relation to the articulation of a regulatory or market rational state with a developmental or plan rational state setting substantive economic and social goals. In the end, they also seek to define the socialist characteristics that are associated with China's socialist market economy. And interestingly, they do so by saying, and I quote, under the leadership of the Communist Party of China. When I read that, I remembered that in 1975, Mao said, at the moment, our country employs a commodity system, and the wage system is unequal as well. Such things can only be restricted under the dictatorship of the proletariat. I found in this volume that the authors actually cite Marx on the structure of politics and on the cultural, legal superstructures. But I think, one also needs a theory of politics, and indeed, in the Chinese case, one needs a theory of culture. So in a sense, one of the most important features of China is that in contrast to societies in which the capitalist mode of production predominates.
Mick, may I just, sorry to interrupt, but your mic is very close to your, like we are hearing a lot of static.
Echo, okay. So in contrast to societies in which the capitalist mode of production predominates and the state is capitalist, corporatist, or oligarchic, in China, essentially, capitalists are not the ruling class. The Communist Party of China is the ruling class, and it's one of the most fundamental characteristics of and fundamental determinants of China's economic, political, cultural trajectories. In the theoretical sections, Elias and Alberto seem to start with a theory about the inevitability of market regulation. At an early stage, they say, and I quote, market-based constraints of the meta mode of production cannot be superseded in the present historical phase and might be progressively overcome only in the very long term. And yet, by the time they reach the end of their discussion of the Chinese case, they identify the emergence of, we call it progettamento. When I saw it first, it reminded me of Matsukuto's mission-oriented restructuring of economic life, right? To innovate and achieve common goals and objectives and to share risks and rewards. But what they identify is an economy with plans and projects, strong state-owned corporations, a public banking system, public development banks, substantial collective resources, playing a leading role in the development of the Chinese economy. And towards the end, they actually speak about China's recent development, heralding, and again, I quote, an increased role of rationally conceived and formulated proactive state-led actions in the economy as a whole, while gently downgrading that of automatic market regulation mechanisms. And they identify, a historical process where the act of projecting large-scale investments becomes increasingly central to the overall development strategy. And then they note, and it's extremely important, I mean, they note that in the early part of the new millennium, China started to prioritize technological progress, indigenous innovation, environmental protection, high quality development, a fourth industrial revolution, or is it a sixth industrial revolution? But they don't actually elaborate much on these plans, nor do they actually pay a lot of emphasis to China's counter-cyclical investment programs, including, the massive programs for rural development, the massive programs for Northeastern, Central and Western development, and so on. However, it seems to me that this argument about the recent development of China is perhaps one of the most important contributions of this volume. But, I noticed a couple of issues that I suppose I thought might have been discussed, because in capitalist societies, investment depends on profitability. If in China, one sees the emergence of a capitalist class and capitalist enterprises, are they subject to that declining trend in the rate of profit? And if so, what are the implications? So it's one of the laws, that Marx developed in relation to his account of capitalism that is in a sense extremely important, and yet it's scarcely discussed in this particular volume. And one can also point out that markets are essentially incapable of distinguishing between useful and spurious uses of resources. So on the one hand, one has the construction of infrastructure for a carbon neutral economy, and on the other one has private air travel. Essentially, it prioritizes the consumption of the ultra rich, and it settles competing consumption claims according to ability to pay, and almost solely in terms of ability to pay. So these are issues, that I think need to be discussed in relation to this particular articulation of planning and market that's analysed in this important volume. The second point is a much shorter one. I mean, the authors present an argument about markets, and this is associated with the view that surplus value will continue to be produced. And then that unproductive sectors, and they refer to health and education, must remain within very strict limits. I think it raises important questions. I mean, does unproductive labor actually produce value? Perhaps doesn't produce surplus value. Does private education and private health produce surplus value? Is the constant capital invested in education passed on in value terms? Is it financed out of surplus value, or is it actually an overhead? So I think there are a lot of issues, to do with the analysis of what they call unproductive labor and the role of public services in relation to thinking about the developments, especially at present, of the Chinese economy. The third point is, as they show, our world comprises a series of societies or social formations. They say social economic formations. And they say a social formation is a combination of one or more modes of production. They say modes of production and exchange, or you could say modes of production, distribution, consumption, and exchange, or even of reproduction. So this goes back to Marx, Althusser, the analysis of the articulation of modes of production. And in my view, they are essentially correct. But also, a society is part of an international order. There are internal and external relations that shape their development, as are examined in Trotskyist approaches to uneven combined development. In the volume, imperialism emerges only on page 115. But if you look at China's opening up its market reform, it actually started with ping-pong diplomacy. It started with Nixon's visit to China, with China's entry into a Western-controlled, rules-based order. Although, as they show, China had the strength to set many of the rules for itself by virtue of its retention of monetary and financial sovereignty, its ability to control its exchange rate, its ability to enforce capital controls. although when it entered the World Trade Organization, it actually had to start to make certain concessions in relation to the opening of the capital account. But with Obama's pivot to the Pacific, and in fact earlier, of course, the international circumstances, as Chang Enfu pointed out very clearly just now, started to change in significant ways. And these, in combination with internal changes, are profoundly reshaping China's path. The Belt and Road Initiative, dual circulation, the strategic alliance with Russia, new development banks, collective common prosperity. So the fourth point I wanted to make is that the categories that I just discussed, mode of production and so on, relate to the objective characteristics. So the socialist orientation relative to capitalist orientation of particular economies. Yet they add, and it's an extremely important point, they add normative characteristics, equitable distribution of income, elimination of poverty, protection of the environment, and so on. In the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping often mentioned that the predominance of public ownership and common prosperity are the two fundamental socialist principles. He said, and I quote, "The aim of socialism is to make all our people prosperous, not to create polarization. If our policies led to polarization, it would mean that we had failed. If a new bourgeoisie emerged, it would mean that we had strayed from the right path." So this normative dimension adds vital considerations, but they too cannot be separated from uneven development of productive forces and the position of China and indeed of other countries that embark on socialist paths within the International Division of Labor, the degree of subservience to Western financial institutions and so on. So one needs to look at the articulation of the external and the internal. I was going to say, that in relation to this idea of the articulation of modes of production, in the West, as they point out in the book, some social progress occurred, especially after 1945 until the 1970s. And in a way, one could argue that Western societies at that stage were in fact a combination of two modes of production, a capitalist mode of production and a welfare state, because the welfare state involved a partial decommodification of labor. And in fact, if you remember in Capital, it's only in chapter 6 that in a sense Marx defines what differentiates capitalism from other commodity producing systems, where he points to the way in which in capitalism, labor itself becomes a commodity separated from the means of production and exchange. Beyond that, I would say that some questions can be raised about the analysis of the household responsibility system. In particular, I think one can raise questions about their questioning of the adoption of cooperatives and of the commune system in the early stages of the construction of the new China. I think that they give perhaps too little attention to the Green Revolution in the 1970s. They give too little attention to the enormous increase in agricultural prices in the early 1980s. And more specifically, I think that the achievements of the first 30 years warrant far more emphasis, as in Chang Enfu's account. Beyond that, however, I think that they have provided a great service. And in short, basically, I think that Alberto and Elias provide a significant and important contribution that will hopefully persuade all on the left that they should, critically where necessary, support all those countries that seek to embark on a very difficult path to socialism. And they should seek to avoid judging the complex and difficult choices and complex and difficult paths to socialism that countries adopt as they try to move in the direction of a better world. They should not simply judge them in terms of these abstract and ideal characteristics of, let's say, communism and socialism, but more in the kind of open way in which Elias and Gabriele have analyzed them in this important book. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mick, for those astute and penetrating remarks that point us in the direction of greater detailed engagement with China's application of Marxism and changing policies. So thanks again. I'm sure you've raised some questions there that we will come back to. I will move on now to our next speaker, who is John Ross. John is Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China since 1992, and the publication in Russia of his Why the Economic Reforms Succeeded in China and Will Fail in Russia and Eastern Europe. He is the author of over 500 published articles on China's economy and geopolitical relations. He has more than 1 million followers on Weibo, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, and his articles on China's economy have won several prizes in China. He's author of 2 best-selling books published in Chinese, The Great Chess Game and Don't Misunderstand China's Economy. His new book in English, China's Great Road, was published last year. So over to you, John. Are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Right, okay. Firstly, I think this is a very important book, and I think it's important for 2 reasons. One, because of its content, and secondly, because of its place in the discussion which is taking place in the West outside China. So I hope in this time to deal with both of these. The most fundamental thing in the book that's crucial is it refers to China, Vietnam and Laos as a new socio-economic formation. And I'll underline new, and I'll come back to the significance of that later. We might add, actually, be put us within the framework of socialism, but that's just a detail. I think the book makes it totally clear that that's what it is, right? Okay. I would also particularly draw attention to the book, to the section before dealing with China, which is the main thing I'm going to deal with. The chapters on Vietnam and Laos. They're by far the most comprehensive studies from a socialist point of view published in English on the question of Vietnam and Laos. And that's very, very important because it shows that the basic approach taken in China can be expanded. So I particularly draw attention to those. Okay. Now, let me deal with both the place in the discussion and on the content. Right. I've been studying China's economy for over 40 years, and I've been writing about it for 30 years. And I would say, as regards the Western left, during most of this time, let's say for 25 of these years out of the 30, the Western left wasn't interested in China. It had a view that China was a capitalist, most of them, not all. There were a few people that didn't. To give them their due, for example, the Party for Socialism and Liberation in the United States was very clear that capitalism had not been restored in China. They thought it was a danger, etc. So not everybody. But the general view, and certainly not mine, the general view was that China was capitalist and therefore they weren't interested in it. This in the last 5 years has changed drastically. Now the left has, I would put it, is discovered China. They've suddenly decided that this is an important issue. But unfortunately, they're not learning from China. It's a sort of arrogance, which is, oh, maybe China has got up to our standards. You know, we in the West have achieved nothing, and China has gone from almost the poorest country in the world to being a high-income economy and taking 850 million people out of poverty. So perhaps we've got to teach it a great deal. It's arrant nonsense. The main thing that the Western left has got to do is learn from the astonishing achievements of China. And I would say, unfortunately, that what is presented as, even amongst those who've now discovered China, is not China. It's what I would call left Sovietism. That means it attempts to project that the Soviet Union model is what China had, or there is some continuity, and this is not true. It absolutely underestimates the originality of China. That is a new socioeconomic formation and what are its tremendous achievements. Now, in order to do this, the left is forced to falsify things, to say things which are not true. For example, I won't name names because I don't want to attack individuals. I want to deal with ideas. I've heard in broadcast people say that until mysteriously the Soviet Union was overthrown by Gorbachev, the Soviet economy was the most rapidly growing in the world. This is absolutely untrue. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet economy was growing no faster than the average for the world economy. And by the mid-1970s, the Soviet economy was growing more slowly than the United States. When people draw attention, I'm a great defender of the Soviet Union, believed it was a great disaster that it was overthrown. But people draw attention to a period of the 1930s and particularly between 1929 and 1945, in which the Soviet Union adopted a model which was a totally statified, self-enclosed economy, basically for military reasons, because it was necessary to militarize the economy in order to defeat fascism, and it was successful. And I have many Russian friends, all of whom would say that whatever was done in the 1930s in Russia, anything was justified in order to defeat Nazism. And I basically would agree with that approach. Anything was justified in order to, provided it produced the defeat of Nazism, right? But after the Second World War, the Soviet economic model was a failure. With great politeness to Professor Cheng En-fu, there is no evidence for the view that if the Soviet Union had not been overthrown by Gorbachev, it would be ahead of the United States today. It's simply not true. The Soviet Union by the mid-1970s was growing more slowly than the United States. In the long, whatever was done in the military period of the 1930s, in the long economic struggle with the United States after World War II, when the question was not military, it was economic competition, the Soviet model was a failure. And if we go to 1978, the period after 1978, we see two immense things which happened in the world. Firstly, Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun introduced the economic reforms in China and produced the fastest growth in world economic history. And in the Soviet Union following this, Gorbachev introduced the disaster of moving towards privatization and destroyed the Soviet Union. You couldn't imagine a more contrasted explanation. But people then attempt to defend the Soviet model, not Gorbachev. These people don't defend Gorbachev, but they fail to understand the dead end economically into which the Soviet Union led by the 1970s. And what were the measures by which Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun took the Chinese economy out? And these are dealt with exactly in Elias's and Gabriele's book, right? Okay. What did they? Firstly, they did not privatize the state economy. That is perfectly correct. They outline this in great detail. What they did allow was they did not privatize large-scale state industry. They did privatize the small ones, but which is also dealt with in the book. Okay. What were the key things that they did? Firstly, they broke with the Soviet model because they opened the economy up in the world. This is mainly dealt with in the chapter of the book that deals with the real exchange rate. But the question of the exchange rate is the crucial question to maintain, is to open up the economy. Secondly, they decollectivized agriculture. Some people attempt to say there was a continuity only in China. This is false. Hundreds of millions of people were taken from communes and put into individual private farms, the household responsibility system. This was not continuity. This was a radical discontinuity in the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Decollectivized agriculture. Secondly, they destatized small-scale production in China. In the Soviet Union, everything down to restaurants, local cafes, etc., was privatized. And finally, they used continued planning, but they used planning which used the market. As is outlined in the book, the Chinese economy is controlled not by administering the economy in the way that the Soviet Union did, but by moving the macroeconomic level of investment and up and down. This is very good. It precisely indicates the difference between the dominant mode of production, as they would put it, that is the one which controls the economy, and the prevalent one. The majority of the Chinese economy is not state-owned, but 40% of its investment is state-owned. This investment is concentrated in the largest companies and it dominates the economy. So finally, just to try not to overrun my time, the crucial thing, and this is the book is an important part of this, the Western left has got to learn from China. It's not got to think that what it's got to do is teach China. It's completely backward, achieved nothing compared to what China has achieved. It has to break with the left Sovietist model, which it's attempting to project as China, because that is not what China has done. And it needs to look at the real originality and the great achievements, not merely practically, but theoretically, of China's economy. So therefore, both, and this book is an important part of this, precisely because it indicates it's not a continuity, it is a new socio-economic formation. So finally, therefore, to conclude, the book is extremely important, both from its content, which I recommend. It breaks new ground greatly by looking in the analysis of Vietnam and Laos, and it occupies an important debate, one which I'm also engaged in, but I'll pay attention to their book at the present time, not anything I've written about it, to reorientating the Western left to break in with left Sovietism and getting into understanding what is the achievements of China. Right, thank you very much. End.
Thank you very much, John, for that very clear comment and those strong statements, how important it is for the left in the West in particular to get to grips and understand the significance of China and to advance their understanding of socialist history and socialist experience. Our next contributor is supposed to be Peng Zhaochang. I'm not sure whether Peng is here though.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, good. Right. Let me introduce you then. Peng Zhaochang has taught at Rollins College in the US before he went back to China, and he's now working at Fudan University in Shanghai. He received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where his chief supervisor was, there seems to be some interruption there. Are we all right? Yeah, his...
I just muted that person.
Yeah, his supervisor was David Kotz. Okay, over to you, Peng.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny. I believe this new book by Gabriele and Jabbour is a very meaningful attempt to try to explain the nature and try to understand the future trajectory of Chinese economy. Of course, in their book, they also discussed Laos and the Vietnamese economy, but since I am particularly familiar with the Chinese economy, so I will just focus on my thoughts on the nature and the future direction of the Chinese economy. My discussion is divided into two aspects. First, I like to emphasize one particular element of the Chinese political economy, which is the leading role of politics represented by the Chinese Communist Party in keeping the socialist nature of the Chinese political economy. Number two, I would like to discuss some of the challenges that China is still facing in order to keep Chinese economy onto the socialist track. I will particularly use the current anti-COVID-19 battle in Shanghai, because I'm now right in the middle of Shanghai, being kept within our neighborhood. Okay, so first, I would like to emphasize that even though we are discussing Chinese economic development, we have to understand that both from the point of view of Chinese ancient history and from the point of view of how socialist revolution started in China. We have to remind ourselves of Lenin's famous saying, that is, politics is concentrated economics. From the point of view of Chinese ancient history, China has never had any social and economic formation that can be called market-centered or commodity-centered. We know that in ancient Greece, particularly in ancient Athens and ancient Roman Republic and Empire, that was in the ancient classic slavery period, and in the Mediterranean area, there was it's an economy dominated by market exchanges. But in roughly the same period in China, around the period of Qin Shi Huang's unification of China, Chinese economy was already represented by the state's strong intervention and domination of the private sector. Yes, China had a rampant private sector 2,000 years ago at that time. However, the state kept strong intervention and control of the private sector. That was very different from the market-centered slavery period in ancient Greece and Roman Empire and Republican Empire. And in the modern period, in the early modern and modern period, China also had significant differences from the Western civilization. In the early modern period, the market-centered, market-oriented economy re-emerged. This time, the dominant form was a capitalist mode of production instead of slavery mode of production. But as Marx commented in various manuscripts of Capital and the Three Volumes of Capital, what unified slavery and capitalist mode of production was market changes. Marx even used the term, used the word capital in the context of ancient slavery, collective slavery. But in China, if we look at early modern and modern China, again, in contrast to the second re-emergence of market-centered economy, this time called capitalism in the West, in China, we only saw some early penetration of capitalism into the Chinese natural economy. But quickly, the Chinese Communist Party, influenced by October Revolution in Russia, started to be formed in 1921. And so if you look at, this is another interesting contrast between China and the West. In the West, the early modern capitalist revolution happened first, and then various bourgeois political parties became formed. But in China, it's the Communist Party that was formed first, and then it led China to launch a revolution. First, a new democratic revolution, and then socialist revolution. So from the very beginning, the Chinese socialist project was a top-down project led by a political party called Chinese Communist Party. So I'm trying to understand why in Soviet Union, after Gorbachev's political reform started, Soviet Union gave up the socialist mode of production, where China was able to change its development path onto opening, market reform and opening, but still keeping basic state-owned means of production and land, public ownership of land, both in rural and urban China, allowing some foreign capital and domestic market forces. So why socialist trajectory was given up in Soviet Union but kept in China? I would say this historical legacy couldn't be ignored. And currently, as we all know, President Xi Jinping, after he took power in 2012, he has kept emphasizing the need for strengthening ideological education in universities. The largest department in China right now is not the traditional disciplines. It is the school of Marxism. School of Marxism has spread to all kinds of levels of Chinese universities. No university in China right now cannot exist without having a school of Marxism. This is a top-down administrative order. So this shows that Chinese Communist Party has the intention to keep Marxist ideological control of society. Xi Jinping also has somewhat what we can call a partial comeback to the Maoist type, but it's still in the middle of it. We know that China has different types of mode of production. The socialist one does exist, but in the private sector, capitalist mode of production also exists. And if you look at the relative shares of the two modes of production, it can hardly be said that the public sector overweighs the private sector. Instead, if you look at the percentage of total employment and the number of enterprises, the private sector certainly outweighs the public sector. So to what extent can we say in China, the social and economic formation is still socialist? I think even though you can say that the Chinese state-owned enterprises, they occupy the key strategic sectors. But in terms of the percentage of employment, etc., it's still smaller than that of private sector. So the strongest evidence, I think, is it lies in politics. Still, we have to come back to the point I want to emphasize: politics. Politics is deciding China's future. As long as Chinese Communist Party would like to uphold its dominance of the Chinese society, it will have to rely upon a strong public sector, and also relies upon the lower and the middle social classes to uphold its social legitimacy, political legitimacy. And I think the current the heightened conflicts between China and the U.S. certainly has lent strong help to that purpose. For example, Chinese Communist Party is continuing to reminding itself of the lessons of the demise of the Soviet Union. If Chinese economic system is going in the capitalist way, what would be the legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party to stay in power? So the precondition for Chinese Communist Party to still enjoy legitimacy in the eyes of Chinese people is to keep the economy a socialist one, a socialist formation. It could allow private sector and private capital to even prosper in some way in Chinese economy. However, it is always up to the Chinese Communist Party and up to politics to decide on the future of the private sector. Just like the market reforms and opening up was a policy initiated by the Communist Party in the top-down way. So I think my first point is, what can we say that Chinese economy could be market socialist one into the future, and we have to look to the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to sustain its legitimacy, and the U.S.-China conflict will only help with that purpose. Second, my second point is that even though we could find it hopeful that China will remain to be a market socialist one, we have to look very seriously at some of the challenges. For example, the current battle between the pro-socialist forces and the pro-capitalist forces in Shanghai, centered upon whether the central government's policy to dynamically eliminate COVID-19. Why is because I'm now being affected by this battle. It's already 2 months, but Shanghai is still in the middle of this.
Sorry, Pang, I have accidentally muted you when I was trying to mute somebody else. Could you please unmute yourself?
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. Okay, so Radhika, could you remind me how many seconds ago?
Yeah, just 2 or 3 seconds before.
Okay, no problem. Okay, sure. So in Shanghai, we have already undergone 2 months of quarantine inside our own neighborhood. I have been thinking about why it is so hard for China to struggle against COVID-19. Because we all know that in the past 2 years, the Chinese government has been boasting of the socialist institutional advantage against the West, where the West has chosen to open up various markets where China was able to successfully eliminate COVID-19. But the battle in Shanghai and in other cities in the past 2 months changes the whole picture presented to people outside of China. So I think it is not because of the failure of Chinese institutional advantage. It is because the Chinese socialist institutional advantage has not been realized in the actual practice in Shanghai, and this is because I would say primarily because the strong influence of private sector or capitalist mode of production in Shanghai. We know Shanghai is one of the most opening up cities in China, and the various leaders in Shanghai actually has relied upon the private sector to carry out various public projects as well. So they do not, the public officials in Shanghai, they lack the classic Marxist sense of planning abilities to organize the people to come into the battle against COVID-19. So if we think about what Lenin did in the new economic policy period between 1921 and 1923, Lenin reminded the Soviet Russian Communist Party members that this is a strategic retreat from classical socialism. And the purpose of new economic policy is not to give the upper hand to capitalism, but to give the opportunity to the officials, Communist Party officials in Soviet Russia, to try to learn from the capitalist enterprises, to learn how to organize a planning system This is some of the skills that they must achieve in order to advance into a more classic planning period. However, in Shanghai, I don't think in the past 1 or 2 decades, the public officials they have this consciousness. They simply allow the private sector to expand, and what their task is just to try to rely on them to achieve some of the economic development tasks. So in this case of Shanghai's battle against COVID-19, yes, Communist Party is still in control. However, economically speaking, they are not learning the skills of how to transition from the market-centered period to a future planning period, or what we can call, borrowing the authors of this new book, the new projectment period. I do think that the term "a new projectment economy" is a brilliant term. It tells us what the future difference could be between the Chinese socialist economy and the Western economy. However, in reality, I think we still face significant challenges to make that realized, to make that realized in Chinese practice. So what I want to say finally is that the battle between socialist mode of production and capitalist mode of production, and the purpose to uphold the socialist nature of the social and economic formation, still faces huge challenge. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm done. Thank you, Jenny.
Jenny, you're muted.
Yeah, Jenny, you're muted. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks so much, Peng, for that absolutely fascinating discussion there, very, very wide-ranging, and raising many probing questions with your emphasis on the politics and the role of the Communist Party and the tensions, within the system between bureaucratism and mass mobilization, and the question of the neighborhood committees in Shanghai, the fact that in some areas they were not very effective. So now we move on to Michael Roberts. Michael worked as an economist in the City of London for various financial institutions for over 40 years. In the heart of the beast, he says. He's written several books, including The Great Recession, A Marxist View, The Long Depression, World in Crisis, Marx 200 and Engels 200. That was his latest volume. He's joint author with G. Cardecci of a forthcoming book, maybe it's out already, to be published by Pluto Press, Capitalism in the 21st Century Through the Prism of Value. He actually produces a regular blog commenting on the capitalist crisis and important economic developments. And if you don't read it, you should become a follower, because it's extremely informative. So over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny. I know we haven't got much time, us participants, in this review, and there are so many things to cover in this book that I'm not going to be able to do that. I hope to put something down in writing later on in the next few weeks to review the book and give it the promotion it deserves. Let me start by saying I think Alberto and Elias have come forward with a very ambitious and profound attempt to reanalyze the nature of the economies that carry through the overthrow of capitalist states. There's not many of them, and so we need to understand what happened in those and what has happened since capitalism and the state controlling on behalf of capitalism was removed in countries like the Soviet Union, China, and Vietnam, Laos, and others that have been mentioned already, and also Cuba that has not been mentioned so far. And I agree with the general strand of the book, which is that China is not a capitalist economy in the sense that the capitalist class does not control the state. It doesn't dominate the economy, although it's a very sizable section of the economy, as has already been explained by other reviewers. but the dominant controlling sector of the economy remains the state and the public sector in general, and also the ability to plan, at least at a macro level, the way in which the economy is to be structured in terms of investment and dealing with the crises that can come up. And we can see that as a result. I don't need to repeat this too much to remind you that China avoided a slump in the Great Recession of 2008-9. In fact, it's avoided all the slumps that capitalism has had since 1950, and there has been, I can't remember how many now, but at least a dozen, and getting worse on each occasion. So on anybody who starts from the point of view of saying, well, capitalism is just operating in China just like any other country, as John Ross has pointed out, is really talking nonsense. They've not looked at the evidence. But having said that, I have to ask myself whether this socialist-oriented economy, if you to use the author's terms, is sufficiently explained in the book, particularly those aspects of the which I think are rather important, namely the role of law of value in China and other countries, and that relates to the theory of Marxist theory of value, and also the nature of the transition that's taking place in China, particularly in relation to what I think is perhaps missing from the book, which I'll come to in a moment, is the serious contradictions which Peng has outlined to some extent that exist in China and other economies like that at the moment. But let me just deal with a theoretical one for viewers, which hasn't been discussed in the book, and it's in the book. There is quite a long discussion of the theory of value and the labor theory of value in the book as Marx developed it. And actually the authors reach a conclusion, as far as I can follow, they can correct me if I'm wrong, that they actually think Marx didn't quite get the theory of value right. And they prefer the interpretation or the explanation of value theory provided by the neo-Ricardian Piero Sraffa. And they accept the view that Marx had errors in his understanding of the process of value and how it operated in a commodity market economy. And as a result, we need a weaker, to use their phrase, I think, acceptance of the labor theory of value, where surplus is what matters, not surplus value. Now, it seems to me if we move in that direction, we're allowing a merger between the basic mode of production under capitalism, which is production for surplus value and the accumulation of profit by private accumulation, and it's surplus value that is the criteria under capitalism, which drives the capitalist production. If we're now just going to talk about surplus, as the authors point out, all economies develop surpluses. The question is how they're controlled, operated, and appropriated. And that is not clear that they're making any particular distinction any longer if they adopt Sraffa's position, which I think a long series of Marxist economists, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, some of whom are participating in this meeting, have spent some time in refuting Sraffa's position. So I was surprised to see that appear to get a favorable reception in the book. And I think you might say to viewers, well, who cares whether they think Sraffa's right or Marx is right? Well, I think it does matter because it relates to also to the nature of the transition from capitalism to socialism, which the authors also deal with and outline. And if you, I think, look at the book, I seem to think that basically they think that Marx also made mistakes and has got an incorrect view about the transition towards socialism and communism. I think at one point they refer to the two stages that Marx talks about for communism, the lower stage and the higher stage, or for Lenin's interpretation, the socialist stage and the communist stage. Marx talks about a lower and higher stage of communism, so does Engels, while Lenin talks about socialism being the same as the lower stage. Now they're saying, I think, that communism is like a far-off dream, and that in the meantime, we have to concentrate on moving towards socialism. But if we read the Kotter program carefully and what Marx's view is, you may disagree with Marx, but he seems to be saying that both socialism and communism, or both the lower stage of communism and the higher stage of communism, imply the end of commodity production. Commodity production no longer operates under socialism. A state has begun to disappear. Commodity production is no longer not only dominant, but has become a minority that is gradually disappearing and should disappear if the process of transition towards socialism is taking place. Now, that clearly is not the case in China or these other countries. Quite the reverse. Commodity production is a sizable proportion of the operation of what's going on in China. So we have to ask ourselves, is the process of going towards socialism fully justified by the argument that actually socialism can include commodity production, which is what our authors, Elias and Gabriele, are offering to us. They're saying basically it's market socialism. By that may mean, yes, the state's in control or dominant, but commodity production operates, and commodity production will continue to operate under socialism. It's going to be a form of market socialism. As far as I'm concerned, that's certainly would, I believe, be an anathema to Marx and Engels. They did not consider you could have market socialism. And also, it leaves out perhaps one of the most important things, which is the nature of the contradiction that raises between commodity production under capitalism and a planned economy with social control and ownership by the people as a whole. I'm reminded of what Che Guevara said when a lot of people in Cuba raised the question of market socialism as the way forward. He said, the law of value and planning are two terms linked by a contradiction. It's a Trojan horse of socialism to talk about the law of value operating in socialism in the form of a market socialism, because in such a hybrid system, if it was to exist for any length of time with capitalist elements, it provokes a contradiction which can only eventually be resolved in favor of capital. And that seems to me the danger that we have with all the economies supposedly transitioning towards socialism when the capitalist sector is so strong. And what we would be expecting in the transition to socialism is that the market sector of the economy would begin to shrivel, and that we would see an expansion of the planned socially owned sector where everything is produced through direct production and not through commodity exchange. And we can hardly describe China as being in that position. And that brings me to the other worry I have about the book, that there is no discussion of the contradiction which exists between those two modes of production that exist in China or elsewhere. It's as though the capitalist mode of production can be incorporated into the so-called socialist mode of production in a complementary and harmonious way. When I consider that against, say, the Marxist economist Preobrazhensky, when he looked at the question of the Soviet Union and the primitive socialist accumulation, Preobrazhensky's work on the development of the Soviet economy was precisely to oppose the contradiction between the development of commodity production, the private sector and capitalism, and the development of the plan and the socialist sector. And these two were in contradiction. And he discussed how that could possibly develop over the whole period. By the way, as far as I could tell, I looked at the index, Preobrazhensky is not mentioned at all in the book, which suggests to me again that there's a lack of recognition that there is a serious contradiction between the capitalist sector in China and the state-run sector as well. One of the other big things that's missing from an understanding of move towards socialism, let me remind viewers, at least those who have read Marx and Engels on this question, even before we get to socialism, with the dictatorship of the proletariat, which means basically the overthrow of the capitalist state and its replacement by a workers' state, or workers in control of the state machinery to begin with in order to plan towards socialism, you started from two basic democratic principles, both developed by Engels and recognized by Lenin. The right of recall of all the officials, without the whole had to be elected and recalled, and no official to earn more than 4 times the average wage of the worker. That was the attempt to keep control of the state machine in the hands of the workers and to allow the development of workers' democracy as a way of taking forward the transition to socialism. Do those criteria apply to any of the transitional economies mentioned in the book? Are those two criteria of workers' democracy mentioned in the book? It's as though these are not relevant to the process of the transition to socialism. And I think they are very relevant, and they cannot be ignored, that any transitional economy where the state machine is not under the control of workers being able to recall their officials and is where the state machine and the top officials are earning way, way more than the average wage and conditions of workers, just as we see in a capitalist state, threatens the very basis of democratic workers' control of the state, and therefore, in my view, a transition effectively towards socialism. So the result is, viewers, that what we have to recognize is a serious contradiction mentioned by Peng in the case of Shanghai between the capitalist sector and the state sector, the plan which threatens the whole process of the transition to socialism. That contradiction we see revealed increasingly at the present moment, not only over the attitude of the Shanghai leadership and the private sector in the lockdown, but also look at the real estate disaster which has now appeared in China as a result of privatizing the real estate sector. Instead of having state housing at rent at reasonable prices and expanding that over the last 30 years, the Chinese leadership went for a completely privatized real estate developing sector based on debt. And as a result, we now have serious inequalities in China. The inequality of income in China and the inequality of wealth in China cannot be described as socialist or moving towards socialist. Far from inequalities declining and narrowing and converging, that's not taking place. Yes, 850 million people have been taken out of destitute poverty over the last 40 years. It is a demonstration of the power of the state sector, the planning mechanism, and the opposition to the capitalist mode of production. But the capitalist mode of production operates seriously in China, and as a result, the inequalities exist not only between urban and rural workers, but also between billionaires and the average worker in the cities as well. And we have a huge range of these various billionaires and private venture capitalists who continue to operate in China. It seems to me, as Che Guevara puts it, we have a Trojan horse for the transition to socialism as a result. And that's something the book seems to ignore, in my view, implying that there is a sort of harmonious equilibrium that we can achieve with this new social economic formation, with commodity production and the law of value and state planning for an indefinite future. I don't think we do have an indefinite future of harmonious connection between the two. And that we have to be aware of. There's a serious risk of reversal of all the gains that China has made, that the Soviet Union also made. I think they did make gains. I agree with John Ross that not by the 60s and 70s, they're unable to progress any further. Well, we cannot deny the tremendous gains made by the state sector and planning in the period after the revolution of 1917. But it was reversed in the Soviet Union. We went back to shock therapy, back to capitalism. Look what we have now, Putin's capitalist Russia. There is a danger that that could happen as well in the case of China, unless we recognize that there is a serious contradiction developed between the law of value, planning mechanism, and workers' control and democracy. And although the book makes a brave and wonderful attempt to explain how China has been and how it's developed in this new social economic formation, what I think it seriously lacks is a recognition of that contradiction and the recognition of the risk of reversal.
Thanks so much for that, Michael. Going to the crux of the issues there in terms of questions around the private appropriation of surplus value and questions of workers' democracy, highlighting also the political risks of reversal. And we'll look forward to your review. And we'll move on now to our final speaker, who is no less than Radhika. Radhika Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies, director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Canada. She's author of Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, which was published in 2013. Of course, Radhika has led the way in forming the International Manifesto group and driving it forward. She's to be found frequently on webinar panels and is a prolific writer on concerns of capitalist crises and other international affairs and drawing on her formidable understanding of Marxism and economics. So over to you, Radhika.
Thanks very much, Jenny. And I just want to say it's a great privilege to be part of this panel, not only with two really distinguished authors, but equally distinguished commentators who have done an absolutely fantastic job. I must say that I feel that Elias and Alberto's book is really critically important. And not only is it critically important, but it supports many of the central theses of the Manifesto that the Manifesto group put out last September. It is entitled Through Pluripolarity to Socialism, and you will find it at www.internationalmanifesto.org. So please consider reading and signing it as well. The themes that are particularly important in the manifesto that are also echoed by Elias and Alberto is that the historical utility of capitalism has long been, or certainly is by now, exhausted, that socialism has been showing the way forward for more than a century. And obviously not without problems, which I think some of the previous speakers have brilliantly pointed out, but nevertheless, it is this experience, nothing is built overnight. So, and nothing is built without making errors. So I think examining these experiences is critically important. Taking them seriously as attempts to build socialism is what we need. And so to this, Jabor and Gabriele have made a really important contribution. And I think it's even more important that although, like Michael and a few other speakers, I have some difficulties with the way they understand Marxist analysis of capitalism as contradictory value production, as I would put it. At least they have made a serious attempt to understand what's happening in China, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Marxist terms, in terms of Marxist concepts of their critique of political economy. So very often when one comes at the end of a whole bunch of speakers, one finds that one's points have been more or less covered, but I'm in the relatively fortunate position that this is not the case. So I want to focus on Elias and Alberto's discussion of money and finance as they work and as they should work in China. And I think this is critically important today because financialization, the international dollar creditocracy, as Michael Hudson and I called it, which rests on the structures of financialization and the pressures it generates on the rest of the world outside the capitalist core is critically important. In fact, you could even argue that the existing international monetary and financial system forms the greatest drag on development today and will form the greatest obstacle to any country trying to build socialism. And so reforming them, beginning with money, reforming and ensuring that money and finance work in a way that is conducive to building socialism in individual countries is critically important. And that's why how China's money and finance are understood is also critically important. Not only what they've got right, but again, potentially what dangers exist, because I think many speakers have already alluded to the fact that in China, there exist important forces that are going to push in the direction of ever greater liberalization, ever greater deregulation, and possibly even in the direction of neoliberal financialized capitalism of the sort that we have in Western countries. And so this remains a political battle, this remains a danger. And these forces, if they are going to do anything, their first target of attack will be the monetary and financial system. And that's why it's very critically important that we understand what's going on. So the evolution of the international monetary and financial system, which, as I say, it revolves around the New York, London, and essentially the sort of hyper-liberal countries and their financial systems like the United States and the United Kingdom. The evolution has, up to this point, resulted in the fact that in its days of senility, economic senility, productive senility, capitalism has reverted to a mode of bank industry relations that is speculative and predatory, because the key is how do finance and the productive system relate, and that therefore bank industry relations are critically important. So today, bank industry relations in the leading capitalist countries are speculative and predatory, and they form the basis of the dollar-based international monetary system, or the dollar creditocracy, as we would call them. How did it come to this? Now, if we look at Marx's writings, we find in them a very important distinction relating to finance. He very explicitly argues that capitalism, when it is born, finds in existence a pre-existing financial capitalist class, which has operated in a feudal system. It is engaged in usury, etc. And this is the financial system that capitalism inherits. But then Marx goes on to say that as capitalism develops, it will create a financial system which is more suited to its needs, a financial system that will aid accumulation by enabling productive investment. Now, Hilferding, coming later and observing much later developments, developed this understanding in his Finance Capital. And what we see there is basically the following thesis. I'm paraphrasing massively, but roughly this is the understanding we see. That as the first industrial capitalist country, Britain managed to develop by keeping the pre-existing financial system in place. Partly this was possible because, of course, in the first industrial revolutions, the need of capital was small, etc. So you could get by with individual fortunes being the basis of investment. You didn't need a very sophisticated financial system aimed at productive investment in the British case. So, and of course, as time went on in the latter part of the 19th century, this financial system also formed the basis of the international gold sterling standard. And it could function thereby, and if you're interested, I'm happy to share articles which describe all this and analyze all this. It was able to function as the basis of this international gold sterling system precisely because it was an archaic, feudal, predatory, speculative type of financial system. The modern capitalist system that Marx had envisaged developing did not develop in Britain, but in those productive industrial powerhouses that challenged Britain's industrial dominance beginning in the late 19th century. They developed in Germany, in Japan, and in America. Hilferding doesn't talk much about Japan. He doesn't talk about Japan at all, but he does refer to the German system, which is his paradigm, and he says that the US system is very similar. So the United States used to be one of these countries that had a developed productive financial system that was aimed at productive investment. However, beginning in the 1970s, as the United States began its second attempt to make the dollar the world's money, or maybe third attempt, but anyway, its post-1971 attempt to make the dollar the world's money, that required the creation of a vast international financial system that would form its basis, because essentially by creating increased demand for the dollar, which was merely financial demand, not productive demand, not trade-based demand, just financial demand, they essentially aim to counteract the operation of the Triffin dilemma. So this financial system has developed through a long series of deregulations, beginning with the lifting of capital controls in 1973-74, and then reaching a peak with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and it continues to this day. And this process of deregulation has reverted it back to a sort of pre-archaic, predatory, speculative financial system, which has nothing to do with America's productive economy, which, of course, over the same period has been declining massively. So the task for socialist countries in the financial realm are not only, as Elias and Alberto say, to establish monetary sovereignty, to match savings and investment, and to manage financial risks. There are certain other additional tasks. You have to manage manage the risks that the dollar system creates, to insulate socialist countries from them, and all developing countries need to do that. Ensure that bank-industry relations remain fundamentally productive, that there exist bank-industry relations, that the banking system does not become a form of usury, a form of lending for consumption, which is essentially a form of usury, etc. To keep the role of finance within bounds, not permit it to replace that of money. Because remember, a large part of the problems that Western capitalist countries have is that wages are replaced by credit. This is not a very stable arrangement in the first place. It is also to organize asset bubbles. And finally, it is to ensure that the transition takes place from money as capitalism wants it, which is taking commodified forms, to money as an accounting device to manage the economy. And we can discuss this further, but in all of this, one thing is critically important, and that is capital controls. As Keynes emphasized, without capital controls, you cannot have the kind of control over your economy and its monetary and financial relations that you need. China has them today, but there are also great pressures to lift them progressively, etc. So I'll finish my remarks here, but I just want to register a few other little disagreements that I have in this otherwise valuable and fundamentally important book. First, as others have already pointed out, I think Marx and Engels did not think that socialism was without value. They thought the socialist stage was of great value. I do not agree that Marx and Engels got their value analysis wrong. I think this is a huge problem and we have to remove it. I also don't think that the law of value applies under socialism. I think socialism is precisely a process in which the production of value is replaced by the production of use values. And I think that one very critical thing that we need to discuss is, one of the ways of rectifying some problems of planning has, of course, been increasing market freedoms to allow markets to function within certain parameters in order to create better coordination. But there are other better alternatives to market coordination. It is the great tragedy of the Soviet Union to have essentially collapse, or not collapse, but essentially come to an end precisely at a time when information and communication technology, on which Soviet scientists were working very hard, had precisely come to the point where they enable vast apparatuses of planning with sophisticated information feedback loops, etc., which we can have today, which China can have. China does not have to continuously go towards market solutions to any planning problems. China can actually start implementing a much better planning system. And I think that's something we should introduce into the discussion at any rate. And I think maybe with that, I will end there. I may have a few other points, but I'm sure I've taken enough time, so I can bring them in the question and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Radhika, opening up the whole question of bank and industry relations and how we might compare socialism and capitalism along that dimension, as well as that amazing observation at the end about the use of data. So I think that completes our panel contributions for now, and I'm going to open up for questions and contributions. I know that there's been some discussion going on in the chat. I am going to keep this bit relatively limited. So if you're making contributions, please keep them focused and to the point, and similarly with any questions. And then we're going to move on to responses from panelists. And I'm sure that so many questions have been raised that panelists will wish to respond and develop any points. So I see we've got one hand from, and as I say, if you want to make a contribution or question, please use the hand function. Brian Green, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I review every month the statistics that come out of the Chinese Bureau of National Statistics. And I can assure everybody who's on this Zoom meeting that the data is crystal clear. Since 2013, the rate of profit in China has halved. The annual rate of investment, which was nearly 50% in 2009 and 2010 before the pandemic, had almost fallen to stagnation point below 5% per annum, which is roughly in line with inflation with a PPI. This is really how the law of value works itself out. And you can all argue about the forms that take place in China, the special characteristics. Well, I have to tell you that unless the Chinese state, the PCB, reverses the rate of profit, the fall in the rate of profit, which they have done to a limited extent during the pandemic by taking advantage of the pandemic and overpriced exports, their room for maneuver, whether they are private or state, is being reduced year by year. And that should be the central core of this discussion. And Michael Roberts is aware, because I've provided him with the figures on a more or less systematic basis, that the relationship between profit and investment in China is no different to any other capitalist economy or country. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. David Ayrton's got his hand up.
Just some questions, comrades. John Ross talks about how the Soviet central planning model was constructed as a consequence of war. Perhaps we might say wars, both the wars of intervention and the upcoming Second World War. And then it stagnated around, I think he said around the 1960s onwards, maybe 70s onwards. Is it possible that as a consequence of imperialist pressure on China today, which we see manifesting itself beginning in the war, the proxy war against Russia around Ukraine, is it possible that China will need to turn back toward planning in circumstances where foreign investment dries up and foreign markets for exports dry up? My understanding of domestic policy and foreign policy is that they are completely interconnected, and therefore a shift in foreign policy and therefore a shift in domestic policy may become necessary. On the question, the general question of socialism versus capitalism, which I tend to find a little bit boring, why bring it up, you might say then? Is it the case that to call it socialist at this stage, that we're not in a historical stage where socialism can be constructed? I'm really thinking about early Marx. Michael Roberts talked about not the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, but the dictatorship of the party. Which class is in power? The party is in power. That's not a class, is it? And what I'm thinking about is it the case that the national formation, the national democratic revolution is still in process? And I'm thinking about really how Marx in his early works talks about the popular revolutionary dictatorship and the role of the working class, the role of the proletariat within that process. Marx was wrong, wasn't he, in 1848? We weren't going straight to socialism. In the imperialist oppressed world, the developing world, we might call it, it's probably not a historically materialistic possibility to move to socialism in the full sense as we know it. And this is a question that needs to be raised, in my view. I'll leave it at that for now, although I've got some other questions. But thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So we've got clear questions there from David and Brian. If anyone else wants to ask a question or make a contribution, please do so now, because I'm not going to come back for a second time. No one who's been putting stuff in the chat wants to articulate? Ian. Sorry, I can't see your surname.
I'll just read out what I put in the chat, if that's all right. Quick, but I hope and fear searching question about the issue of time scale. For as long as capitalism is the dominant mode of production on a global level and pushing society towards climate breakdown, is there sufficient time for a socialist-oriented minority of countries to progress to socialism and be gradually joined by other nations? Or is a more radical change in the international system required for sustainable progress?
Okay, another nice clear question. You know, we've been going for more than 2 hours actually. And so I think I'm going to move swiftly on to give panelists a chance to comment on anything that's been said or on the questions that have been asked. And I'll go in order, in their speaking order. And then I want to give Elias and Alberto a decent chance to round things off at the end. So if I could go to you, Mick, a quick 2-3 minutes.
How long time, please?
Okay.
Sorry, no, we're going to go to the panelists.
Mick Dunford, yeah.
And then you, Elias, and Alberto will have a good chance at the end to take up the points that you want to respond to. Okay, so we'll just start off with Mick and then go through the order that people spoke in.
I'll just make one comment. I mean, Wen Tiejun has written a very interesting account of China's evolution, you know, from 1949 to the present.
Sorry, again, we're getting the crackles on your microphone.
Okay. Wen Tiejun's written a very interesting book, you know, about China's evolution since 1950. And I mean, the book is called, well, he wrote a series of books, you know, 8, 9, 10, 11 crises. So, you know, China's development has been punctuated by a series of crises. And I mean, I'm thinking about what Brian said about the question of profitability. I mean, I haven't seen his numbers, but clearly if the numbers he presented are correct, then obviously the situation is in a sense quite serious. But in the past, China has found a way, largely through public investment, of addressing these successive crises. And in many senses, I think, you know, one can be reasonably optimistic that it can find a solution, you know, to the slowdown in investment in relation to this one. But I suppose I'm just an eternal optimist. I just do think, you know, that how can I put it? I mean, you know, we live in a world in which we face a series of extremely serious challenges, and it seems to me that there are countries that designate themselves as socialists that are actually trying to make serious contributions to addressing problems of poverty, the problem of climate, the problem of the absence of democracy in the global system, you know, in the sense that states are not treated as equal, and that we therefore have to do what we can to support and these projects. And to me, that's one of the great contributions of the book. You know, it deals with 3 countries that are actually seeking to make a real difference, you know, for the quality of life, not only for their own citizens, but for all citizens in this world, however imperfect, you know, what they might be doing may be in terms of, you know, certain kind of abstract concepts of socialism or capitalism.
Thanks, Mick. John?
Yeah, I would just say that we've got the left's got to raise itself, particularly in the West, to deal with the scale of what it's doing with. It's dealing with the most important issues in human history here, and contemporary human history. Let's take this. China has raised 850 million people out of poverty by World Bank standards. If this was achieved by capitalism, then you have to be serious. Capitalism remains a progressive system if it is doing that. If you take the case of also Vietnam, of course, Vietnam hasn't raised the same number of people out of poverty as China because it's a much smaller country, but in the proportion of the population taken out of poverty in Vietnam is the same as it is in China. So you have to deal with the following paradox. If you take this capitalist view, in countries which declare themselves to be socialist, 76% of the people in the world have been taken out of poverty, or in countries which describe themselves as socialist, and only 24% in countries which describe as capitalism. Why is it that the socialist countries succeed and the capitalist countries fail? But if it is done by capitalism, it's a progressive system. Be serious. Socialism is a premature adventure in that case. Right, okay. Secondly, you've also got to deal with the question about what Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun achieved in 1978. I'll put it bluntly, they saved world socialism. If China had continued on the same path as the Soviet Union, it would also have collapsed. Therefore, that's what they did. And they achieved it by creating, as the book says, a new socio-economic foundation. It's one of the greatest theoretical achievements in Marxism in history. Right, okay. And therefore, that's what they did. That's what they did. They saved world socialism. And why on earth does the left in the West want to try to support a post-World War II Soviet system which failed and led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, instead of learning from China, which saved world socialism and produced the fastest economic growth in the whole of human history? And then finally, just on whether it's capitalist or not, let me give you what happened after the 2008 financial crisis. The book deals with this in some detail, but I'll give you the statistics. In the 5 years after the 2008 financial crisis, investment in the United States fell by $500 billion because it's a privately owned capitalist sector and nobody could control what happened to the investment. In China, in the 5 years after 2008, investment rose by $1 trillion. Why? Because it's state controlled. In the United States, you receive, if you're a private capitalist, you receive a nice little letter from the president saying, will you invest more, please? To which you think, no, it's not profitable, so I'm not going to do it. In China, you don't receive this. You receive an instruction from the state sector. You are going to increase investment. You don't have choice in the Chinese banks about whether you're going to lend. You receive a quota. That's what's happened in 2008. You will lend this amount of money. This has got nothing to do with capitalism. It was put rather popularly by in China, but it said the following: under capitalism, the billionaires tell the state what to do. Under Chinese socialism, the state tells the billionaires what to do. I can put it in a more scientific way, but that's a very good popular way of putting it. End.
Thanks, John. Peng? Can you unmute?
Okay, I would like to just pay attention to one more point. That is, if we want to have a clear definition of socialism, then we have to pay attention to two different versions of the definition of socialism. One is the classical Marxist one. The other is the one being used by the Chinese Communist Party. According to classical Marxist definition of socialism, certainly if you have a significant private sector, you are not a socialist economy. So that's why Lenin was a classical Marxist writer. So Lenin said, Lenin defined the new economic policy of Soviet Russia as having a dominant state capitalist economy. So in Maoist period after 1956, China could be said to be having a a socialist economy. But after 1978, Deng Xiaoping invented a term, the primary stage of socialism. But primary stage of socialism was no longer part of the classical Marxist definition of socialism. So that's why, so if we would like to understand the current Chinese economy in the classical Marxist sense, then it has to be understood in the transition from capitalism to socialism. So the primary stage of socialism, yes, you can call it socialist economy, but that shouldn't be confused with the classical Marxist sense of socialism. And what I would like to emphasize is that with Xi Jinping taking power after 2012, I think the Chinese Communist Party leadership is seriously considering bring Chinese economy firmly onto the track of socialism. And this is why the poverty elimination program has been so successful, at least in rural China, and this is why in the conflict with the U.S., Xi Jinping has been expressing strong intention to stick to Chinese autonomous development path. But again, I want to emphasize that with the initial market reforms and opening up, being with us for over 40 years, we are facing significant challenges. The new era by Xi Jinping has been with us for only 10 years, but the post-1978 market reforms and the post-1992 privatization of state-owned enterprises, they have been with us for much longer years. So the challenge for the new era of Xi Jinping is to strengthening the truly socialist forces to march toward the more classical Marxist sense of socialism. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks, Peng. Michael?
Yes, sorry, Jenny, I was listening closely to that. Just a few words. First of all, I don't think anybody's.
I love you, Robert.
Nobody's addressed the question I raised about the fact that the great Marxists of our time, including Engels and Lenin, said that the very starter at the dictatorship of the proletariat must be to establish a workers' democracy and maintain that if we're to progress towards socialism. The two principles outlined by Engels and adopted also by Lenin, which of course are not applying both in the Soviet Union in the end and not applied in any of the new social economic formations in China. So does that matter? Does it matter that there's no workers' democracy in these countries? That's the question that hasn't been discussed or answered. And secondly, I would say that the differences, the contradictions, which Peng again has revealed in the question of how the economy is developed are, well, how can I play it? Downplayed. There is a serious contradiction between the commodity production and the capitalist sector in China and the state sector, the plan, and the drive for social need. This is expressed very clearly by Xi in his recent comments, that this is the battle that's on. But this battle is something that should have been well on the way to being won over the capitalist sector. It shouldn't be one where the capitalist sector is in danger of usurping power as it did in the Soviet Union. That's the risk that I feel. And I feel that the book on the whole has ignored both that aspect and the aspect of workers' democracy in its discussion of the new social economic formation.
Thanks, Michael. Lastly, to Radhika before going back to the authors.
Yeah, thanks. I'll also try and be brief, just two, well, 1.5 quick comments. In terms of the conception of how do we theorize the transition to socialism, I think that in one sense, I think what the book does is it takes largely sort of fairly mainstream economics, so maybe critical mainstream economics, and then tries to theorize socialism from that perspective. And I would suggest that a more useful way of doing it would be to take the developmental state literature that has tried to theorize and understand how productive power has been built in the face of existing capitalist domination of the world economy. I think that is much more useful because that contains both certain capitalist countries such as Germany, Japan, etc., and the United States in its time, but it also then in the 20th century begins to contain both the socialist economies, Soviet Union, China, etc., but also the late developing economies like South Korea and so on. And I think that this is far more useful, and I think it does not conform to neoclassical understandings or neoclassical economics understandings, and it points to the real challenges. And I think the ultimate reason why this is important is that, why is it that socialism begins its history outside the core of the capitalist world? I mean, the Second International expected that revolution would occur first in the core capitalist countries and then would extend outwards. This is not what happened. The reason for that is very simply the fact that capitalism, which is inherently imperialist, offers to countries outside its core such poor prospects that countries that can the countries that could essentially insulate themselves from the world capitalist system in order to develop have done so. Indeed, even capitalist countries have had to do so. So I think this form of understanding, which really takes the dynamics of imperialism and incorporates it centrally into the understanding, I think is very critically important. And that is why I emphasize the importance of capital controls. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. Now, Elias and Alberto.
Yes, I will.
So many questions have been raised, but again, I think if you can each go for about 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay, I confess if I reply any question, any one-for-one question, I will stay here until tomorrow. I will try to summarize my thinking in some words. I'm speaking from Brazil. I believe that my intellectual perspective is different from the English intellectuals, the North American intellectuals. It's a very different perspective. What I want to talk to speak when I put this question, because I think that we in general, because general spoke about the contradictions in China. We can observe the contradictions in China, the law of value in China, the capitalists in China. I'm living in a country where 100 million people live in a very poor conditions. And these conditions lead me to find another type of reply to understand China. In first thing, I think that the socialism is a baby in history. Socialism have only 100 years. Only 100 years. Capitalism 600. The feudalism 2000 years. The slavery over 2000 years. We have only 100 years. We demand a lot of socialism. In these terms, for example, when I began to study the socialism question, I convinced that we put beside some concepts. For example, the concept of first stage of socialism, second stage of socialism, the first step. I prefer I prefer be influenced by Hegel and observe the concept, how the concept, the manifest in itself, how the concept manifests in the real movement. When I observe with this view, I abandoned a lot of things, things about socialism. For example, this question about checklist on socialism. Socialism, for example, Michael Roberts bring a question about workers' democracy in China. How can we discuss workers' democracy in China in a country with recent urbanization? In the last 10 years, China becoming China urban citizens, 130 million people in China. I think that the workers' democracy in China is a long learning process. And during this process, the CPC, the Communist Party of China, will be the role in these questions, for example, like democracy, the workers' democracy, and others. This is one question. The question about the real questions to do about China. I think is evident. The contradiction is the engine. In my point of view, is essential part of process. In this sense, what I think the real question to do about China. How can they get
Elias, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Elias seems to have frozen. Oh, he's gone. Alberto, are you ready to take up the reins here? Alberto?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear, yeah.
Okay, so I will start with sort of a joke. I'm an economist from Italy, which is a Western country, but paraphrasing Zhu Eli, I will try to betray my class and try to reason and act as a world Marxist economist and not a Western Marxist economist. Well, this said, a lot of questions.
Come back.
Okay, after.
Okay.
Let me go now. So, okay. A lot of questions were related to very fundamental issues, like among them, the relationship between socialism and communism, and the relationship between socialism and communism, of course, and worker democracy, or more generally democracy. So first, I start with the second one. Of course, democracy is very important, but we try to write a book about essentially economic issues and to a lesser extent social issues. We practically didn't touch the issue of democracy, otherwise the book would be longer than the capital. And we think it's important. We think we're not particularly competent in this field, and it's important to discuss it, but I think we acted correctly in a scientific and epistemological way to leave this question aside. with respect to the related issue of inequality, we recognize that there is a lot of inequality in these socialist-oriented or partially socialist countries. And I myself did some work, and I published 2 papers with other people, one on the issue of income distribution in Cuba, and another on the issue of income distribution in China. They're very important. We consider them one of the most important contradictions of presently existing and imperfect socialism in China, but also in Vietnam and Laos. Our view, I want to be respectful to all the participants, so I have to be extremely short and blunt, but this doesn't mean that I don't respect their views. My view on communism is that it's a kind of utopic, in the best sense, perfect world which might be reached progressively to some extent over a long period of time if socialism develops. But it's not particularly useful at this stage to mix up the concepts of communism and socialism. And I agree with the fact, as far as I know, according to Marx, socialism was supposed to be a very short period that would have rapidly led to socialism, to communism. And this history proved Marx wrong, and we have to deal with socialism and its imperfections for a long period of time and try to go towards more and more elements of communism with a lot of attention and modesty. Then by the same token, somebody has said that achieving a harmonious and equilibrated and effective progress towards socialism in China, like elsewhere, is far from being granted. I agree, this is not granted. The fact that China is now more powerful and probably has entered a more advanced stage in its form of market socialism does not mean that they don't make mistakes and that everything will be fine in the future. We'll have to see. We hope for the best. All we can say is that China is more equipped, is more advanced than capitalist countries, and then also than other socialist countries that have not progressed as much as China. We cannot say China will do everything right in the future, of course. And I go to the issue of low value. I'm simplifying to an extreme an issue that has been discussed for over a century by the best minds of Marxism and also its adversaries. In my view, Marx was basically right on the low value. He made some technical mistakes that have been corrected in a very abstract way by the Sraffa and his tradition. But in my view, this difference is far from being a big one. It's a technicality. And as we know, it refers only to the abstract world that exists only in the minds of the economists of perfect competition. We know that the world, there is not such a thing as perfect competition. And the fact that competition is, in fact, a very tumultuous process, and that everywhere there are extremely high elements of monopolistic power, in my view, is an element that takes a lot of weight away from the supposed contradiction between Sraffa's and his tradition solution to the transformation problem and that of Marx. Substantially, I see a lot of continuity. And then Somebody has mentioned the green revolution. Of course, it was very important, and the technical changes are very important. And there is, or there was at least, a simplified Marxist tradition that attributed all the changes in the deterministic way, all the changes in the social fabric and also in the social relations of production to technical changes. So material, abstract, external forces of production determine the course of history and the appearance of capital and then social. This is a very naive way to see things. We think that, of course, technical changes are important, but technical changes, after all, are discovered and applied by men and women who live in the real world and participate in the development and in the class struggle. So we are strongly against technical determinism. And then I would like to mention the issue of radical discontinuity. In our view, there was and there was not a radical discontinuity since '78 in China. Of course, there was, because otherwise we would not talk about market socialism in China. But in our book, we also recognize the many achievements of China in the Maoist period, and we strongly deny the Vulgata according to which China was socialist under Mao and is not after, and there was a complete and existential discontinuity. So in this sense, we do not agree. Of course, in the sense that a new type of social formation was born in China 40 years ago, yes. So there was a radical discontinuity, but there was not a complete throwing away of the basic principles of socialism. And one principle that we think is very important in China and Vietnam and should be applied everywhere by socialists when they achieve political power is to try to put forward a form of what we call market compatible planning. That is a form of planning that ex post is not in contradiction with basic market forces. Otherwise, we go too much under the law of value and we make a mess. I would like to mention as last the...
Could you make this the last point now, Alberto?
This is the last point. This is the last point. Well, I've worked a lot on the economy of Cuba. And if you're interested, you Google and you find many articles I wrote on Cuba in English. In my view, Cuba is great, is a great example of heroism and socialist resistance and so on. But until recently, they were still going on the wrong path of the non-market approach to socialism. I see that now, finally, some meaningful reforms are going on, and I hope they will work.
Thank you. Elias, you were cut off. Do you just want to say something to finish off?
No, Alberto, say all.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much to Alberto and Elias, and thanks to our panelists. Michael Roberts sent his apologies. He had to leave early, so he missed some of the authors' comments at the end. We've had a very productive and wide-ranging discussion, raising a huge number of questions about socialism, about China, about the current situation that socialists face. And I'm sure that we will be able to carry these forward in further webinars planned by the International Manifesto group and also by Friends of Socialist China. So with that, I'll say thanks very much to everybody. I hope you found it rewarding, and I'll bring this webinar now to a close. Thank you.